Macedonia near the Yugoslav border. They are believed to have come under fire and were possibly captured or killed. Ground and helicopter search teams from several NATO countries have been launched. President Clinton was advised at 3 p.m. Eastern Time today and is being kept apprised by his national security advisor. Tomorrow morning's Washington Post reports that for weeks, CIA Director George Tenet has been warning that Serb forces might respond to a bombing by accelerating their campaign of ethnic cleansing, which of course is precisely what has happened. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
SACEUR was authorized by the Secretary General after consultation with allies to extend the range and the tempo of operations in order to maximize the effectiveness of the campaign. But this is not phase 3 as such. In fact, I think to some degree it's misleading to talk of phases, because what we are actually seeing is one campaign, one strategy, one objective, which is simply to make an aggressor pay the price for unacceptable behavior, which cannot be tolerated under any circumstances.
The behavior Shea referred to is what NATO describes as a massive ethnic cleansing operation being carried out by Serbian forces against the population of Kosovo. NATO says Serbian army and paramilitary police are going literally door to door and telling people to leave the country or face summary execution. NATO accused the Milosevic government of stripping the refugees of all official documentation as part of a plan to prevent them from ever returning to Kosovo.
The Yugoslav forces, so we are learning, are destroying the archives of the Kosovar people, property deeds, marriage licenses, birth certificates, financial and other records, public records, are being systematically destroyed. This is a kind of Orwellian scenario of attempting to deprive a people and a culture of the sense of past and the sense of community on which it depends. This attempt to rewrite history reminds me of George Orwell's 1984, which I used to believe was fiction, but now seems to be actually happening in reality.
Kosovars continue to flee by the tens of thousands and threaten to overwhelm bordering countries like Albania, whose economy had already been struggling. The Albanian ambassador to NATO issued an urgent plea for help.
Imagine what it means for a small and impoverished nation to handle such a crisis. The government is doing everything it can to address this crisis. The local population is also mobilized, but the crisis is aggravating every hour and is well beyond what we can do. The international community is mobilizing its efforts to come to our assistance, and I would like to emphasize that as it is an issue of utmost emergency, it demands concerted and urgent action.
Relief planes began arriving in Bonino, Albania today. The Clinton administration is vowing to contribute $50 million to refugee relief. Other NATO members are also pledging support. On the diplomatic front, Russian Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov returned home today, his effort to broker a ceasefire yesterday a failure. He accused NATO of already having made up its mind to continue the bombing campaign.
The Yugoslav side has given a signal that, if so desired, can be interpreted as a signal to stop the airstrikes. When we arrived in Bonn, we became convinced that NATO has an agreed line aimed at continuing military action on Yugoslav territory. This military action can lead to nothing but new complications for the world. They will lead neither to stabilization in Kosovo nor to stabilization in the Balkans. They can only complicate the situation on a global level.
Later in the day, the Russian government announced its intention to deploy as many as 7 warships to the Mediterranean to monitor the situation. The State Department reacted to that this afternoon.
We are obviously concerned by the signal such a large deployment might send to Belgrade and other countries in the region, while the Russian Foreign Ministry has made it quite clear that Russia does not intend to become entangled in the conflict in the Balkans, and President Yeltsin made that very clear yesterday. The deployments of these ships we don't see as a particularly helpful gesture.
Some members of the Russian parliament are unhappy with the way their government is handling the situation. A fight broke out in the Duma when some members charged that the Primakov initiative was designed only to build domestic political capital for the upcoming December elections. Russian citizens showed their displeasure with NATO and the U.S. in the city of Rostov. Demonstrators destroyed U.S. imported goods and defaced U.S. flags. In Washington, a group of former U.S. defense and diplomatic officials called for ground troops to be deployed to ensure Kosovo's security, a recommendation the administration has repeatedly rejected.
I would assign to them the mission of obliging Milosevic to withdraw his troops from Kosovo and ensuring the future security of Kosovo, and that might require some presence on the ground for a long period of time. How long this would take is anybody's guess at this point. The Pentagon has said it would require at least 200,000 troops. I should think it would require at least that. And it would be a sustained conflict. I don't think we ought to underestimate the difficulties of doing this. But once you start threatening the use of force, and your bluff is called and you use force, then we have to prevail. There's just no question about it. And the future of NATO, as well as the future of the people of Kosovo, is very much at stake.
In front of the White House this afternoon, more than 2,000 Albanian-American demonstrators rallied in support of NATO attacks. The group called for Kosovo's independence and for NATO to send in ground troops to defeat Milosevic.
NATO said its internet homepage and email system were being jammed with computer viruses and email from Yugoslavia. A spokesman said military computers were not affected. For more details on the worsening refugee situation, we have three reports from Independent Television News from Tom Bradby, Colin Baker, and Mark Austin.
Across the border in neighboring Albania, the sheer volume of refugees was creating new tensions which were spilling over into lawlessness. Some locals were robbing refugees. This man arrested in the square this morning. The police were wearing balaclavas because they did not want to be recognized by friends and neighbors as they tried to ensure it was brought to a halt. Most locals are helping, but they can't cope with the numbers. And the police began to panic today, shouting at the refugees to load up so they could be transported south. This child was put on the wrong truck and almost left without his mother. Of course, many were crying today. The adults faced with questions no parent wants to answer and none here can. What is happening? Why is it happening? What will become of us? At the border, the people still came. What becomes more and more striking as each day passes is the sheer scale of this tragedy. Standing here, thousands and thousands continue to stream past. And as they come, the Serbs are taking away their documents and their passports so that they have no proof of their nationality. Bedri and Sevdir had abandoned their tractor and come on foot. Both their children had chickenpox and had cried all the way. They were totally exhausted, but local Albanians bundled them into a car and took them to hospital. They explained they'd had to take the children from their beds once the Serbs began shelling the village.
It would have been better to die together with our kids in our home than to suffer like this.
Tonight, the Crises family have nothing, know nothing of their future, and are left to suffer the despair of the dispossessed.
They're using trains now to cleanse Kosovo, a race of people being killed and expelled, a dark shade of history repeated, and a cry uttered 6 decades ago is now heard again. Who will help us? But not the Macedonians this time. Refugees were kept on the train at the border. Only a few were allowed off. They'd been rounded up at gunpoint by the Serbs, made to board the train. They thought they were going to their deaths. Then they saw the border, but instead of safety, only despair, as they realized they were being sent back to the hell they thought they'd escaped 12 hours earlier. But the train did come back this morning. This time the refugees, 2,000 of them, were allowed to walk across the frontier. Their last week's experiences horrifying.
I just wanted to say, just if somebody can hear me, just if somebody can help us, our people. I don't know what to say else. I stay in the basement 3 days and wait for somebody to kill us.
Her two sisters were killed, but she's concerned now for those still alive in Kosovo.
If they stay there one day more, today they are going to die, some of them.
Besa Bislimi came on the train with her family. They'd hidden from the Serbs for a week.
We were more than 2,000 people in one train without no tickets, like animals in a train.
We walked for a while. It didn't matter where, because it was away from the past.
I don't know.
What did you think was going to happen to you when they put you on the train?
To die. What else? To die.
Their stories are all identical, of fear, of shooting, of death, of anarchy targeted against the ethnic Albanians. And once again, stories of trains being used in Europe like cattle trucks to remove the unwanted.
In the freezing mountains high above Kosovo, the old and the weak are struggling to survive. These are the stragglers in the exodus of fear. Stuck in the snow, a van we found carrying a cargo of human misery. They are the women and the children from one small village in Kosovo. Their husbands and fathers are missing. The driver told us they were taken away by Serb paramilitaries. If it's true, they may never see their menfolk again. This woman, who's walked for 36 hours with her daughter, said her husband was a fighter in the Kosovo Liberation Army. He had been captured with others, and she said they were herded together at Serb military installations, the targets of NATO bombing. They are uncorroborated stories, like all the stories emerging from Kosovo at the moment. But almost everyone fleeing from their homeland is saying the same thing. Heavy overnight snow in the mountains has stemmed the flow of refugees. Those who made it across say thousands of others are stranded, cold and hungry. But the vast majority of the ethnic Albanian population are either out or coming out. These refugees are now safe. They tell us the only people left in their town are those too weak to leave or those still fighting the Serbs. Through a campaign of systematic violence and killing, or simply through the threat of it, the Serbs have achieved what they want to achieve. This tiny republic of Yugoslavia is under intense strain, but they're keeping the border open for the refugees. Some have relatives here, but most are in desperate need.
Please help us. You see where sleep my baby. I don't know what to do, where to go. Not just I, but all the people from Kosovo. Please help us.
Do you think you'll ever go back to your homes?
What?
Do you think you will ever go back to your home?
No. No, I'm afraid. Never.
In the panic to leave, families have been split up, children lost.
I don't know where is my woman, where is my children, where is my sister in family.
You don't know where they are?
No, don't know. Maybe today come, I don't know.
Going back into Kosovo, these two nuns, to look for their fellow sisters who have been working inside the province. But otherwise, it is a one-way flow, the other way.
The Senate Armed Services Committee has been receiving regular briefings on the war. We get ours now from the committee's chairman, Senator John Warner, Republican of Virginia. Senator, can you add, those are terribly moving stories.
Indeed they are, Jim, and about 6 months ago I was in Kosovo and saw the suffering from the Milosevic butchery campaign last summer. And we'd hoped after the Holbrooke mission that we'd reach some accord, and then of course Rambouillet, and it fell apart. And whatever you and I discussed tonight and our panel to follow, I'm sure there's grounds for what if and criticism, but I would urge all at this time to focus on the risks being taken tonight by American flyers and those of 8 other allied NATO nations as they continue to carry out this military campaign.
Have you heard anything in any of your briefings, Senator, that would lead you not to believe the stories of these refugees as to what is going on and why they are leaving Kosovo?
No, I think there's a mounting body of evidence to corroborate these tragic stories by individuals.
In a general way, how do you feel about this mission 8 days after it began?
Well, we had, I think, a basis to believe that Milosevic would not have subjected his own people in Belgrade and elsewhere to the type of very serious damage being inflicted by the air campaign. But he has not, for reasons perhaps someday we will learn more fully. I think all the diplomatic efforts, including perhaps the futile one by Primakov, have been made, and he only historically responds to military pressure. And we've got to stay the course. There are no other alternatives. I know that valued colleagues of mine have thought about, let's arm the Kosovars. In my judgment, and this is just one person's judgment, I think within 2 weeks he will pretty well have fulfilled his objectives in Kosovo of ridding the Kosovar army of any ability to combat his takeover of that region.
And so there's literally nothing NATO could do about it now, even if they wanted to?
Well, NATO is doing everything they can. Weather has been a serious obstacle. Terrain is like an enemy.
Why is that?
Well, because I've walked those hills and seen them. It's very mountainous, and pockets of fog hang in. Bad weather can come up in a matter of minutes and obscure a target. But NATO has done everything it can within the framework of the use of air power and is continuing. We're moving into, I don't know, whether it's phase 1, 2, or 3. That's irrelevant. What we're doing now is concentrating on those assets that Milosevic personally needs to continue to conduct his campaign in Kosovo and perhaps pose a greater threat across the borders.
Now, that includes some military targets right in downtown Belgrade, does it not?
I should not, nor should any of us, discuss specific targets. But the NATO people, and mind you, this campaign is not just an American campaign. It was planned by 19 nations and presumably the best military staff that can be brought together and reach a consensus. That's why we should stick with it. But we shouldn't discuss targets, but we know we're going to bring it to his command and control and his ability to communicate with his field commanders, and at the same time, to the extent weather and other factors like shoulder-held weapons, which they have in abundance down there with the tanks in Kosovo, to the extent we can, we're going to bring pressure on those military units, trying to clean out the pockets of the Kosovar resistance.
Now, you mentioned
the KLA.
Yeah, the KLA. Now, is the KLA effective? Is the KLA resisting this?
This is a legitimate question, and I think we should, at some point in time, examine the intelligence we once had, which indicated it was substantial and formidable. But I have not as yet seen where they have put up the type of fight that I thought they would in trying to resist this ethnic cleansing of tragic proportions.
But should we arm them more?
I think not, because, remember, the U.S., and that thought only originated in the United States, the U.S. is but one of a team player of 19 nations, and to inject that here in the closing days of what I believe is Milosevic's ethnic cleansing campaign in Kosovo, he's created the problem he set out to do. In other words, in the adjoining areas with the refugees, he's pretty well subdued whatever KLA opposition once existed. And now he feels he's going to consolidate those gains and then just face the world. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to bring very severe and hopefully unacceptable damage on his command and control and possibly targets in the central region that you mentioned.
But Senator, if I'm understanding what you're saying, Milosevic has already accomplished what he set out to do. We're talking about reversing something.
Well,
is that right?
He hasn't fully accomplished that, because in doing so, he's degraded his military, and within the next 10 days, there will be, I think, much more than we've been able to deal thus far in the way of damage. So, but the ethnic cleansing part probably, and this is just my judgment, will be completed in a matter of weeks. That's why when people say, well, let's bring to bear ground forces, that requires a very considerable amount of time to transport and put in place elements, tanks, heavy equipment, artillery, helicopters that would be used to support those ground units. That option, practically speaking, is not there.
And a lot of people misunderstand that, don't they, Senator? They think, oh, well, let's put in ground troops. Somebody snaps their finger and suddenly there are 200,000 ground troops. Forget it, right?
The ones in Macedonia were designed and equipped primarily for quick extraction of the UN forces, the other humanitarian people who were in there.
That's 28,000 altogether?
Well, that
like
general
that.
number.
6,000 of them are
That's
American.
correct. Now, they could probably deal with isolated units of the Serb army, but if you had to go through and attack the central forces of the Serb army, you need heavy armor of greater proportion that they have, because remember, any offensive operation has to be better equipped than a defense, and they would essentially be put on defense if we were to attack.
Everyone who appears to be in a position of authority within NATO and within the U.S. government, within the Pentagon, keeps saying that there are not even contingency plans for putting troops in there, with the exception of peacekeeping troops. Does that jive with the information you have?
That's correct, and that has been the plan all along. Now, there were studies made, and I reviewed them last September and October, and they were significant numbers of people and heavy equipment, which had to be transported from the Adriatic Sea up through Albania as one of the main routes. And that was a logistic operation that would require a number of weeks.
Do you agree with, in our film clip, we had former Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci saying it would take at least 200,000 troops. Does that a figure make sense to you?
Well, some of the planning in NATO had very high estimates. But again, as we talk to those issues, and I respect Secretary Carlucci, former Secretary of Defense, but someone better look at where are assets, how quickly could they be brought to bear, and the likelihood that Milosevic will not have completed what he set out to do by way of ethnic cleansing in the period of time within which you could bring those in.
So then how do we win this thing if, in fact, everybody has now been saying, no matter where they came down at the very beginning on this operation, Senator, most people are now saying NATO must now win this. Can NATO, in fact, win this without
then you have to go back.
Troops?
You have to go back and examine very carefully the president's statement, which did he obliquely hint at, all right, Mr. Milosevic, if you do not stop what you're doing, then there may be, within the NATO structure, some thought independence for this country. And there, Mr. Milosevic, you will have lost your battle, because that's holy ground, the old 1389 battlefield. And I actually went and saw it one time. That's holy ground.
That's really holy ground
for that's correct.
Serbs.
Absolutely.
Right. We did a long piece on it the other night on this program. But
so the victory in terms of clear winning to me is quite elusive in this situation. But I do not, at this point in time, think we should be criticizing what has taken place, because all these military people have done what they were ordered to do as best they could, considering the weather and the terrain and other factors.
And one of those factors being told at the beginning, you can't use ground troops?
Clearly, the political structure, and it's not just within, although our president made it clear, it was within the NATO framework of planning by this planning staff that that would not be an option. Otherwise, they could have pre-positioned the heavy tanks and military vehicles and artillery and the like, and then had as an option.
Which is what happened in Desert Storm.
It clearly would happen. Right. Now, of course, hindsight may be that you should not have abandoned any option in the beginning, put all options in place, and then determine whether or not to use it. But again, I think at this point in time, we've got to think about the safety of those people flying those missions and not go back and perform a lot of what if and what should have been done. Let's see it through. Stick to it.
But see it through with air power only.
That's correct.
And you believe, and you know a lot more about this than anybody else, you believe it can still happen with air power alone?
To the extent we can be effective in containing Milosevic from going across his borders, destabilizing the other nations, and perhaps further suffering in the KosovA region, air is the one option, and we've got to pursue it. Now again, I think probably in a matter of weeks he will have completed what he set out to do, because we do not have any indications that the KLA is going to give him that type of resistance that would delay his progress.
So how do you feel about it yourself, Senator?
Well, it's a human tragedy of great proportions, but you have to ask your question, what if we had done nothing as a collection of 19 nations here in this most holy of weeks of Easter and done nothing and watched these same pictures? How would you have reacted to that? So it seems to me that we had little choice but the 19 nations of mounting the actions that they have taken to date and to see them through to the finish.
Senator, thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.
Landed at Aviano Air Base in Italy today to participate in a new round of NATO attacks against Yugoslavian ground forces. Pentagon spokesman Ken Bacon explained their mission this afternoon.
Our goal is to, as we've said many times, is to shift our ability toward attacking armor and troops on the ground. And we have begun to attack staging areas and other places where we find these tanks.
The A-10 is nicknamed the Warthog. It was highly successful searching out and destroying Iraqi tanks during the Gulf War.
The A-10 is a specially designed aircraft. It's designed specifically for close air support. It has a very large Gatling gun on the nose that can fire up to 4,000 rounds a minute. It's designed to take out tanks, armored vehicles, as well as the softer targets like trucks or troop concentrations.
The A-10s, however, fly relatively slowly, and at such low altitudes they are at great risk of return fire. 1 week into NATO's military mission against Yugoslavia, only one Allied aircraft has been lost. An American F-117 stealth fighter shot down over Yugoslavia over the weekend. The pilot was rescued, but the incident reinforced that all Allied planes are vulnerable.
Combat is a dangerous business, and the F-117 is tasked with flying through the highest threat environments long before more conventional aircraft make that journey. There are no guarantees, and our pilots, men very much like your sons and your brothers and your neighbors, are courageously putting their lives on the line in support of our national objectives.
NATO's 400-strong combined air force has a distinct American identity. More than half of NATO's planes are U.S. military aircraft. During the first week of the campaign, NATO flew some 1,700 sorties into enemy airspace, primarily from Aviano. The base has operated around the clock since the strikes began, with pilots and maintenance crews preparing constantly for their next mission.
A three-dimensional roller coaster.
Yeah?
Yes, sir.
What do you mean?
Well, if you can imagine being on a roller coaster with no tracks, no wheels, and able to move in any direction in any given second, that's what it is.
Among the attack aircraft at Aviano are F-15 and F-16 jet fighters. Once airborne over Yugoslavia, they're accompanied by one of 6 EC-130s. They act as a sort of mothership during bombing runs, directing and redirecting jet fighters using up-to-the-minute radar and other data. The EC-130s operate high above the bombing runs with a crew of 16.
Our platform is called the ABCCC. It's the Airborne Command Control Center. Basically what we do is we take information from the battlefield that we're assigned to, get information from the AWACS and battle staff in the back, up to 15 people. We take the information and we disseminate that amongst the different fighters, the helicopters, or any other tankers, and we basically coordinate what goes on.
Much of NATO's sea-launched attack comes from the USS Gonzales, stationed about 60 miles off the Yugoslav coast in the Adriatic Sea. Since the opening day of the NATO strike, the Gonzales has fired Tomahawk cruise missiles at Serbian military installations and air defenses more than 100 miles away. The Gonzales has been joined by the guided missile cruiser USS Philippine Sea and 2 other U.S. ships. Together, they launched some 100 satellite-guided cruise missiles toward Serbia in the first week of the NATO mission. In the era of war by computer, it was the click of a mouse, not the punch of a button, that blasted open the missile hatches and unleashed booster rockets. Currently, some 7,300 U.S. military personnel are on ships and bases in the region. Morale appears to be high.
Well,